Resources Institute's webinar on the global land squeeze and how to manage the growing competition for land. I'm Janet Ranganathan, Managing Director for Strategy, Learning and Results. And I should let you know that today's webinar is going to be recorded. It should be available on our website tomorrow. Today, we're going to hear from 3 of the 4 authors of a brand new WRI report that came out. It's out today, and we'll give you the link in a minute if you don't already have it. But it looked at pressures on land. There's a finite amount of land. As Mark Twain once said, they aren't making it anymore. We looked at the pressures from agricultural products, wood, in particular from forest products, and urban expansion. So we looked at those together, and we're looking at them in terms of their impact on land, and in particular carbon. But any kind of land use change has profound impacts for food security, climate change, and biodiversity. So we can go to the next slide, just by way of brief context. Come to the speakers in a minute and just go to the other 2 slides first. First, go to the next slide. Yeah, just by way of context, historically, from around 1750 onwards, we've lost a lot of carbon from land change. About a quarter of the CO2 emissions concentrations up there has actually come from land use change, 25% or more. So it's a big deal for climate change. If you go to the next slide, it's basically, next slide, thank you, Tim.
There we go. Sorry.
Okay, there we go, yeah. Just basically a map of net primary productivity. So it basically shows where the opportunity is to grow back plants and to again remove carbon from the atmosphere. So again, not the whole planet's going to do that. There's a large, like around 30% of the area that's desert, ice or lake. So sorry, Tim, to make you go back and forth. Let's go back to the speaker lineup. I'd like to introduce, without any further ado, our great speakers today. So on the left there, Li Qing Hong, and she is the Food and Agricultural Modeler from WRI's food program. Next to her is Tim Searchinger, Senior Fellow and Technical Director for Agriculture, Forestry and Ecosystems at the World Resources Institute. And Tim is also a Senior Research Scholar at Princeton. And then finally, but by no means least, Rich Waite, Senior Research Associate with WRI's Food and Climate Program. So I think you're going to hear some interesting insights from the top line of the report. Things that maybe you thought were climate solutions might not be, and vice versa. And I also want to mention that there is a shorter insights article on the WRI website that also showcases some of the headlines from that, from the longer report. So with that, I'm going to start with Tim. So over to you, Tim. And I should say we have a Q&A session at the end. So you can put the questions into the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll come to those at the end. So back to you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Janet. And so I just want to say we really were trying to address 4 questions in this report. One is, how big is the global land use challenge? The challenge of simultaneously preserving carbon, maybe restoring carbon, and biodiversity, given the global competition for land for other human demands. Where has other research gone right and wrong? What about all these policies that are actually talking about increasing demand for land, particularly mass timber or bioenergy? And then what are the core solutions? So I'm going to turn it right over to Rich Waite to give us the discussion of the agricultural part of this challenge.
Great. Thanks, Janet and Tim. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. So if we're talking about the global land squeeze, we need to talk about food and agriculture and feeding a growing population. There's about 8 billion people on the planet today. We're likely to be home to 10 billion people by 2050, and feeding the world uses about 35 to 40% of the planet's land outside of Antarctica. It's 5 billion hectares of land or so. And about 2/3 of that agricultural land is pasture land for meat and milk production. And the other 1/3 is cropland. Next slide. In our Creating a Sustainable Food Future report, which we released in 2019, we projected that agriculture is likely to expand by about 600 million hectares between 2010 and 2050. Now that's an area of land nearly twice the size of India. Now, this assumes that crop yields are going to keep growing at roughly the same historical rates they have for the past few decades, but we did caution at the time that more recent rates of yield growth were slower. And if those slower yield rates, agriculture would expand even more. And then kind of as a thought experiment on the right-hand side, we also showed that if there were no productivity gains at all, and farming stayed exactly as it was in 2010, it would take another 3 billion hectares of agricultural expansion to feed everyone by 2050. Now, that's basically knocking down the world's remaining forests. So while that scenario on the right, thankfully, isn't going to happen, it shows the real importance of productivity growth to help alleviate the global land squeeze. Next slide. Now, unfortunately, even that lower amount of agricultural expansion, right, the 600 million hectares under business as usual, would still be really bad for the climate. So we calculated that this level of expansion would lead to about 6 billion tons of CO2 emissions per year from land use change. And that's actually a higher rate than recent land use change emissions, which are more in the realm of 3 to 5 billion tons a year. So 6 billion tons a year of land use change, and that would put the 1.5 degree climate goal out of reach. The world needs to get to net zero emissions by 2050. And an important part of that, getting to net zero, is stopping deforestation. And we have global goals to stop deforestation by 2030, by the end of this decade. And that's completely incompatible with another 600 million hectares of new agricultural expansion. Next slide. So what's driving that expansion? It's important to remember that different foods have different land requirements. So plant-based foods require a relatively small amount of land. This is shown land per calorie. Animal-based foods like chicken and pork and dairy products require quite a bit more land. And then on the high end, meat from ruminant livestock, like beef and lamb, have very high land use requirements. So as incomes grow, diets are shifting towards more of those animal-based foods on the bottom part of the graph. And that increases demand for land. And then in places where we consume a lot of meat and dairy, like here in the US, there's an opportunity to shift back more towards plants to help alleviate that issue. Next slide, please. So keeping that in mind, we can look back at our food demand projections from our 2019 report and see that several years on, our projections have largely held up. So the dotted lines there out to 2050 showed our projections. Our projection for total food demand growth out to 2050 was between 50 and 60%. We projected all animal-based foods, the demand would rise by nearly 70%, and then we projected nearly 90% growth for beef and lamb specifically. And now we have data a few years later for the 2010s in the solid lines over on the left-hand side of the graph. And so we can see, for example, total food demand has actually grown a little bit faster. That's the brown line. Total animal-based food demand growth has also been a bit faster than we projected. From a climate and biodiversity perspective, there is a bit of good news that the consumption of beef and lamb has actually grown more slowly than we projected. It's grown, per capita consumption of beef and lamb has actually been pretty constant over the past decade, but there's still been population growth. So that at the current level of growth, that would still lead to a 50 to 60% growth in beef and lamb consumption by 2050. So that is still quite a big challenge from a land squeeze perspective. Next slide, please. We can also see growth in crop yields continuing throughout the 2010s, but at a pretty slow rate and not nearly fast enough to keep pace with global crop demand. So we calculated that crop yields would actually need to grow 6 times faster in the coming decades than they have over the past 5 years if we want to keep pace with crop demand growth and avoid cropland expansion. Next slide. So if you put all that together, it's probably not surprising that croplands do continue to expand, and we can see it from space. What's kind of alarming is that croplands are actually expanding faster than that business as usual projection that I showed before. We had projected croplands to expand at about 5 million hectares per year over the next 30 years, but it's actually been more like 11 million hectares per year over the past decade. Cropland expansion actually accelerated in the 2010s relative to the decade before, according to the satellite data. And there's been more than 100 million hectares of net cropland expansion since the turn of the century, and more than 200 million hectares of gross cropland expansion. So the gross expansion is shown there in the map in the red, and there has been some cropland contraction, which is shown in the blue. Next slide. So finally, we also know that pasture expansion is happening too. So our colleagues in the Global Forest Watch team found that cattle pasture was by far the #1 use of recently deforested lands since the turn of the century. Now, although we can see gross pasture expansion from space, it is trickier right now to detect net changes in pasture land from space. And so we're working on a pasture watch initiative to try to improve our ability to detect these changes. It's worth noting that FAO does report country reported data on pasture land. That data shows a decline in net pasture land in recent decades, but that's probably just due to land reclassifications that countries have made, bringing land that's been very dry or very little used out of being classified as pasture. And we do know that pasture land is expanding rapidly in these wetter tropical areas with pretty high consequences for biodiversity and the climate. So with that, I will pass it back to Tim.
Thank you very much, Rich. So the second topic we looked at was urban expansion. And urban expansion, we didn't do our own modeling, but what we did was we combined and looked at a whole bunch of other models, and it occupies less land. Urban is only like 1 to 3%, depending on how you define it, of the world's land, but it is expanding and it's significant. And we basically took an average of these different calculations, and it comes to 80 million hectares of land. So that's an additional burden on the world's land between 2010 and 2050 of 80 million hectares. And our estimate is that that would release another 0.7 billion tons of CO2. So the next topic was wood harvests. And the interesting thing about wood harvest and use is that for a lot of purposes, it's either the climate consequences of harvesting wood are not counted, not focused on, even though for some places and some cases they are. And the reason they're not focused on is typically, or it's very common and in various ways, that people who look at these kinds of issues assume that so long as forests are growing on a national basis, sometimes even a continental basis or a hemispheric basis, that harvesting wood doesn't have climate consequences. It's, quote, carbon neutral. Now, this is a map of, one map of the growth of forests globally. And basically every area in green, and depending how green it is an area where you have net forest growth. And we have large net forest growth, and that's helping to hold down climate change. A big part of that is simply due to climate change itself. So every time we put a ton of carbon in the atmosphere, the assumption is that 1/4 of a ton comes out because of increased forest growth due to the higher concentrations of carbon dioxide themselves. So that's why, in effect, when you put a ton of carbon in the atmosphere, scientists don't count it as a full ton's worth of warming. But of course, if we then were to cut down those trees and release that carbon, that sink wouldn't be occurring and net climate change would be worse. Another part of this is the fact that in the Northern Hemisphere in particular, we tend to have regrowing forests. And what you see here is a recreation of forests in Europe, regrowing from 1900. This is a generic thing that's typically happening in the Northern Hemisphere, basically because countries there cut down so many forests by 1900 that they are now regrowing. Why are they regrowing? Well, partially enough yield gains and population stabilization. A lot of it is due to the fact that we replaced horses with cars, which freed up enormous amounts of land. Some of it is actually due to the fact that we've outsourced a bunch of our food supply. So Europe is now essentially outsourcing some of its food supply in the tropics. You get deforestation in the tropics, you get regrowth in Europe. But the key point is that this is also helping to hold down climate change. If you cut down those trees for wood use and emit that carbon, that adds carbon to the air. So the assumption of carbon neutrality is the main reason why wood harvests haven't really been focused on. And one of the things we did with this paper was develop a new model to estimate the carbon costs of that, because even though cutting down, even the fact that other trees are growing in a forest doesn't make cutting down some trees carbon neutral, it is the case that when you cut down trees, they can regrow. And after a few years, they will tend to grow faster than trees if you had just left them alone. And that has to be factored in. So we wanted to develop a model that calculated that globally, that does not give credit to the fact that there are trees growing for all kinds of reasons unrelated to the wood harvest, but does give credit to the fact that trees regrow. And I'm going to turn it now over to Dr. Peng to explain more about how we did that.
Thank you, Tim, for the great introduction. Now let me briefly explain the major uses and fates of the harvested wood. So this flowchart illustrates the global distribution of roundwood harvest into different wood products in 2010 from the FAO data. Once harvested globally, 52% of the roundwood is directly used as wood fuel, and 48% is processed as industrial roundwood. Saw logs are cut into sawwood, while veneer logs are sliced into veneers and transformed into plywood. Pulpwood is processed into wood pulp and contribute to about 40% of the paper production, while the remaining 60% of the paper production is sourced from the recovered paper and other pulp. The remaining industrial roundwood is utilized as a wide range of wood products, such as poles, fencing, and piling. All these processes generate intermediate products, such as wood chips, wood particles, residues, and wood fiber. And these intermediates are further used to produce wood-based panels, which are normally used for construction and furniture. Also, the production of all these different kinds of wood products generate waste that are burned for energy. Next. Next slide.
Oh, you don't see it? This is uses of wood?
Okay, great. Note that the roundwood statistic reported by FAO is after the removal of bark. Let's delve deeper into the wood products categories based on how long the wood products will last. The first category is the long-lived products, LLP, shown in the yellow color. LLP can stay for years to decades. The main LLP on the left includes 10% sawwood and 8% wood-based panels, with the 18% of the total roundwood. And on the right, the other LLP, such as poles, fencing, is about 3%. The second category is the short-lived products, SLP, referring to the paper products, which is responsible for about 9% of roundwood consumption. The third category is very short-lived products, VSLP, which are burned right away for energy. A staggering 69% of the total roundwood is actually taken up by VSLP, where 52% of the wood is for wood fuel and 17% of the wood is burned during the processing of the industrial roundwood. So the bottom line is that most of the wood is burned, and only the 18% of the roundwood is the long-lived products. And lastly, we want to remind that the bark also accounts for additional 15% of roundwood volume and is also burned as well. Next, please. So currently, the per capita wood consumption is not that much, but it will eventually grow when people get wealthier. This is the same as all the other commodities like food, meat, and dairy. Here we use a fixed effect model based on historical relationships between the wood consumption and population, GDP per capita, and time variables. By observing these historical trends, the model can predict the 2050 wood consumption by country based on the projected population and per capita income growth. So as shown in this chart, we predict about 70% increase in the long-lived products, more than doubling in the paper products, and about 90% increase in very short-lived products for industrial waste. And then eventually a 22% increase in very short-lived products again for wood fuel. So all these together leads to a 54% increase in global wood harvest from 2010 to 2050. Next, please. To estimate the carbon costs of these projected wood demand in 2050, we built a new global forestry model, the carbon harvest model, CHOM. CHOM is based on a well-established stand level approach to track the forest carbon. But the novelty of CHOM is to expand the stand level to the global level. So this figure illustrates the stand level scenario, the changes in different carbon pools over time estimated in CHOM, using the Germany forest example. So the carbon pools include the green live vegetation, roots, slush, and different wood products, as well as landfills. The black line here represents the carbon stored in all these pools due to the first harvest. And at the top, the green dashed line is the counterfactual forest carbon storage if the forest is not harvested and is allowed to continue to grow. So the effect of wood harvest on the atmospheric carbon is therefore the difference between this black line and this green dashed line. After 40 years, the wood harvest will increase the atmospheric carbon at 62 tons of carbon per hectare. And if we value short-term mitigation over long-term, we can also use the 4% time discounting to estimate the carbon cost, which gives the 54 ton of carbon per hectare after 40 years. Next, please. Using this approach, we will be able to estimate the annual and 4% time discounted carbon cost of a global wood harvest from 2010 to 2050. Here we analyze 7 scenarios of future wood supply and demand. And the carbon cost we estimate is between 3.5 to 4.2 gigatons CO2 equivalents per year. In the first scenario, where the secondary forest is harvested and allowed for regrowth, the wood harvest using the existing level at 2010 has the cost of the 3.2 gigatons CO2 equivalent per year, which is the darker green of the bar. And then there's another 0.9 gigatons CO2 due to the rising wood demand between 2010 and 2050, which is the light green color at the top. And there's about 0.9 gigatons CO2 of the substitution benefits at the bottom, shown in the light blue color here. So if without the substitution benefits, the total cost of this scenario will lead to 4.1 gigatons CO2. So the bad news here is that with all these 7 scenarios, there are many differences in terms of the carbon costs. Even the scenarios such as establishing new tropical plantation and increasing the plantation productivity can reduce the cost by only about 0.5 gigatons CO2e. So this carbon cost is also close to the annual emissions from land use change due to agriculture expansion.
Great.
Over to Tim. Thanks.
So let's summarize all these. This is the situation we've got. And so forestry is going to use, we estimate about 800 million hectares in so-called clear-cut equivalents. If you count a selective harvest, it would be more. Obviously, these forests aren't destroyed, but they're heavily affected. Agriculture would convert 600 million hectares of land, urban expansion 80. The combined emissions from all of these would be to 10 to 11 billion tons per year. And what's really new here is combining the forestry and the urban expansion with the agriculture to see all of these effects. And obviously, these are wholly incompatible with addressing climate change. So what are the solutions? Well, there are only two things you can do. One is you can consume more efficiently from a land perspective, and others you can produce more efficiently. So we have to consume things that use less land, beef in particular, less food loss and waste, and also burn less wood. It's really, when you count in the bark, it's more like 76 or 77% of all the wood that's harvested is burned. And we need to produce more efficiently. We need these higher crop yields, improved grazing, and we can harvest wood more efficiently, and we can use more of that wood for products rather than burning it. I want to emphasize quite specifically on improved grazing, because lots of people I'll talk about this, tend to assume that this is available just to meet rising food demands. We're probably going to have to intensify something like 200 million hectares of grazing land. That's twice the size of all the cropland in Europe, 200 million hectares in Latin America. That's a big source of deforestation. It can be tripled in yield, but this is a huge challenge. We need that just to meet all the different rising food supplies. This land is often viewed as being available for other things, but is needed already. Okay, so then despite this enormous land squeeze, we have policies to use more land. So one is mass timber, and this is the idea is that concrete and steel have lots of emissions, and we could replace those with mass timber. And the basic consideration is that producing wood panels like this for buildings, the actual manufacturing process at this time emits less carbon than concrete and steel. So lots of people are calling for this, and we looked at the literature on this, and we looked at almost 70 papers, and 55 papers that find greenhouse gas benefits do this because they assume that wood harvest is carbon neutral. That mistake that we've talked about before, which is just because you have forest growing on a net basis, that reducing that growth somehow doesn't have a cost. In many of these papers, most of these papers, the carbon that is actually stored in the building itself is considered a gain. So in theory, just to illustrate this, if you took 100 tons of carbon out of a forest, burn 99 and put 1 in a building, these methods would count that 1 as a 1-ton carbon storage gain. Now, other papers have done pretty much the same approach that Dr. Peng described, and they came with basically the same results that we did. And you'll see that the European Commission also actually came to the same result, although kind of buried it in one sentence in the middle of its forest strategy. And what are those results? The results are that in most cases, using wood for construction, and for virtually all natural forests, would increase emissions for decades, and in this time discounted way. What is the time discounted way? That is, if we care at all about earlier rather than later mitigation, it is the amount of emissions that would occur, the equivalent level of emissions that would occur in the year of harvest if they were permanent. So this looks at the use, even if we could get 40% of the harvested wood into CLT to replace concrete and steel, which is probably the absolute upper limit. In Germany, you would still have a net increase in emissions and both in a PDV value and in absolute terms after 40 years. Now, it is the case, we discovered, that if you were to use plantations or convert natural forests to plantations, to the very fast-growing plantations in very warm, wet areas, such as Brazil, and even in the southeastern US, you can get greenhouse gas benefits. Now, in Brazil, you could get it even with a 40% CLT. In other places, you would need a 70% of that wood to get into construction timber, even in these fast-growing plantations. We don't think that's physically possible, at least today, but at least in theory, that would provide benefits. So what's the problem? And here's our summary. Natural forests, in almost all cases, increase emissions. There are a few where if you had this really high 70% into construction timber, you get a small greenhouse gas reduction, but only small and not worth pursuing. You can use fast-growing plantations in warm places, but the problem is that all of those plantations are already needed to supply that wood demand that Dr. Peng was talking about before. And you could get a greenhouse gas benefit without competing with agricultural land by converting natural tropical forests to plantations. The problem is that would have enormous environmental costs. And the quantities of wood are also vast, and we cite other papers showing the same thing. This is the average amount of increased wood demand under business as usual that Dr. Peng showed, or actually this is the average amount today, this is the amount with business as usual. And to have 50% of construction timber come from wood, or construction come from wood, you need to add even more. So this is a 40% increase on today. This would be a doubling of the increase. And this would have enormous consequences for the world's forests and others. We show other people having similar findings. So we think basically that was a mistake. The other thing is we see huge demands for calls for bioenergy. You'll see lots of estimates that we should have bioenergy with carbon capture and storage of 230 exajoules to stabilize the climate. How much biomass would that be? The answer is it's all of the biomass, all of the plants harvested by people in 2000. It's all of the crops, all of the crop residues, all of the grasses eaten by livestock, all of the wood. That would only still provide 20% of the energy, but you would have to double harvest on top of all the other rising demands. Even smaller amounts are huge. To get 5% of European energy from wood, you'd have to double European wood harvest. 2% more global energy from wood, double global wood harvest. 10% of transportation fuel requires 30% of the energy in all the crops being produced. And the reason for that is essentially that using plants to grow, to make fuel is extremely inefficient. So plants are a way of converting the energy in the sun into usable fuel. But for every 1,000 watts, in the case of corn ethanol, for example, you only get basically 1 watt worth of ethanol. Sugarcane ethanol 2, even cellulosic ethanol 3. And if you were to use that land instead for photovoltaics, you'd get 150 to 200 watts. So you get basically 100 times more usable energy using photovoltaics, which also have the advantage they don't need to use the best land. And then on top of that, you get a 3-fold improvement, increase in output if you use that in an electric engine or in a heat pump for heat than compared to burning these. So basically for every acre or hectare of land that you use for PV, you get 300 times the energy and more than 300 times the greenhouse gas savings than using land for bioenergy. Okay, just to highlight the significance of this, there are efforts now to have aviation fuels come from biofuels, particularly biodiesel, which is the cheapest one. It's HEFA, it's basically biodiesel. To get 25% of future aviation fuel would require doubling global vegetable oil production. And almost all that vegetable oil will come from expansion of oil palm or soybeans in the tropics. So where did these underestimates of the costs come from? And what you see ultimately in various ways, explicit and otherwise, is where people say they think you can have lots of these new wood demands because they assume in one way or other that others will reduce their footprints. So the idea is it's okay to increase the footprint for something we want on the assumption that others will reduce the footprint. But the problem is twofold. The first problem is we need all of the above. As the Americans here know, you can take these standardized exams, and typically the last, you get 4 answers, and the last one is all of the above. And in this case, we need all of the above. We need all of these already if we're going to meet our target of not clearing more land, let alone reforesting land. But on top of that, even if in each case, there's always an opportunity cost. If you use land for one of these purposes, you're not using them to restore or preserve forest. So the related issue is what we would call incomplete accounting. So a lot of papers, when they try to look at the carbon consequences of biofuels or any increased use, they assume that if you don't do that in already forested land, if you use existing cropland, that has no cost. And implicitly, what's that assuming? And it's also something called statistical land use change, is these studies only focus on where you produce, not how much. And if you use more land for bioenergy or wood or anything else, even if it's not in existing forests, it will have to cause more clearing of land unless others reduce their footprints in compensation. So these are essentially making the same error of just assuming that others are going to reduce their footprints if something we want increases its footprint. And the same thing happens actually in economic modeling, something called indirect land use change that happens, where someone with a model might say, and they're all over the map, but a model might say, well, if I increase my demand for wood or crops for bioenergy, it's okay because I won't need, if I use 1 more hectare of land, there won't be a whole new hectare of land because other people will eat less or other farmers will increase their yields. Again, this is essentially saying it's okay to expand demand because others will reduce their footprints. And again, we need all of the above, and there's always an opportunity cost. The last thing I'll just say is there are lots of papers that also imagine there's this thing called huge amounts of marginal land. This was a paper estimating 1 billion hectares of so-called marginal land. As you can see it in the red, that's more than the entire size of the continental United States. But what it basically was modeling, and this is what you see with marginal land claims, is land that's not, they say, isn't going to be great for cropping. But that doesn't mean it's not being used for all kinds of other purposes. In fact, sometimes they're even claiming land that is being used for cropping. There is underutilized land, like underutilized pasture, but as we said, we already need to improve that land in order to meet our demands. So the bottom line, and WRI has made this kind of an official philosophy, is that to solve the climate, to solve the global land squeeze, we have to do 4 things. We have to produce more food on the same land, produce more wood on the same land. We have to use that to protect natural landscapes. We have to reduce the demand for land by reducing our demand for land-intensive products, food loss and waste, land that we burn, or wood that we burn. And then we should also restore those areas that can't be properly used for agriculture, or if we're lucky enough to do a lot of these things, we could restore more. So that's our philosophy, and I'll end it there. And we can, I do want to mention, I want to thank these funding sources, Good Energies, the Packard Foundation, and some institutional funders for WRI, and we'll turn it to questions.
Great. So thank you very much to our speakers. We've got some good time now left to take your questions and hopefully answer them. So please do use the question and answer box. And let's see if we've got any questions coming in. I think there is one for you, Tim, linked to technology. Did we do a technology assessment looking at the potential specifically for engineered pyrolysis to produce renewable fuel or feed in electricity generated by off-gassing and production of biochar from on-site forest production and activity? So the question is really about, do we look at the potential for engineered pyrolysis? And this is from John.
Well, in this paper, we don't specifically do that. And of course, in theory, if you used residues, but there are really not that many residues, you could, these decompose maybe over a 20-year period or so in the forest. If you turn those into a biochar, you might be able to preserve some more of that, although at some cost to biodiversity that use these residues. But I don't think that's a big number. What you've seen when you see big numbers for biochar from forests, they assume you're going to cut down forests and turn them into biochar. And there's papers that basically look at that, and you're likely to have also increased carbon in the atmosphere for a long time because only some of that gets into biochar, plus the biodiversity effects. So biochar, it's a broader topic on whether you can use residues of various kinds to make biochar and competing uses and the potential benefits and all that other, but we didn't specifically focus on that in this paper.
And Rich, I'd like to pass next question to you. The new OECD FAO Agriculture Outlook for 2023 to 32 just released some information about the prediction of global agricultural and food production projections. And just wondering how your findings kind of line up with that.
Thanks for the question.
Simone.
So I haven't read the new outlook yet myself, so I can't say the numbers side to side just yet. I would say, looking at the question, our projections out to 2050 were based off of FAO projections as of several years ago. So I've seen in the FAO OECD agricultural outlooks in the past, they have more or less matched up pretty well. But I'd like to see this latest projection for what's going to happen over the 2020s, because we don't know if the 2020s are going to look like the 2010s did. I think, again, the thing that came out to me when I was looking what happened in the 2010s is that our projections held up pretty well, and that we actually even underestimated food demand growth and also cropland growth. So I think we're not out of the woods by any means.
Thanks, Rich. We have a great question here from Sanya. Does the world have the institutions needed to be able to manage the global trade-offs associated with these competing land uses? So yeah, I don't know of ministries of land management. I don't know who wants to take that. Maybe more than one of you.
Yeah, well, I'll try to take that. I mean, we're not going to have global management of land, and for all kinds of political reasons, and who knows if that would be benign or not. But I think the real problem we have is that we have climate accounting systems that reward just shifting the burden from one place to another or one country to another. So bioenergy is rewarded without looking. If you think of bioenergy, it is a way of using land to produce plants to replace fossil fuels, which is the benefit, but the cost is not using it for other purposes. And essentially that is ignored. I had a paper in Nature in December pointing out that Europe's climate strategy essentially involves more outsourcing of its own food supply, and it's already outsourcing. So the problem is we have accounting systems that don't factor in the real consequences of using land. And I think that's the single thing that we can try to fix if we want good global governance.
I was actually going to say something pretty similar, and I know from that paper, Tim, I don't have the time period right off the top of my head, but it was that forests in Europe have increased by about 13 million hectares in the past decade or two, but at the same time, land use linked to food imports grew by 11 million hectares. So that kind of shows the offshoring if you're not accounting for what's going on beyond the borders of wherever you are.
So we're coming with another question that might be for Li Qing or Tim, but have any governments, to your knowledge, factored in this thinking in the report into their policies relative to the use of laminated timber or other so-called responsible wood products? So are you seeing any kind of the thinking in this report factored into the guidance that's being issued by governments around these?
Not yet. It's really interesting because there are more or less a dozen papers that, although they didn't look at things in as varied a way as we did, more or less came to the same conclusions. If you don't treat wood as carbon neutral for the reasons I've laid out, you're likely to increase carbon in the atmosphere because only a modest portion of that carbon in the tree actually gets into the wood. One thing we didn't mention is that about a third of the carbon is left behind in roots and slash and decomposes. Right there in the tropics, maybe 4.5 tons of carbon are lost for every 1 ton of carbon in wood taken out of the forest. So there's enormous waste along the way, and that's the problem. It is interesting that you can, as I said, you can read the European Union climate strategy for forests or forest strategy. And in this has this one sentence acknowledging that they're likely to, that any increased harvest to provide wood for any of the purposes they contemplate, including construction, is going to increase warming for the next several decades at least. And I just kind of think about this, if a politician had to admit and say, we are going to implement a climate strategy that is going to cost you money, and it's going to increase warming for the rest of your life and likely your children's lives, because we think this is a way to address climate change for your grandchildren, even though by then we may have many, many other methods to reduce carbon. And all that, think of all of the suffering going on around today, and we've just begun. So I think that there is a real problem here, but it really stems from this assumption of carbon neutrality. And it's to, in particular in the Northern Hemisphere, it's in the interest of governments to treat all of the forest gains that are occurring due to CO2 fertilization and the fact that you just have forests regrowing from the huge numbers you cut down in the past, as though that was somehow something that they could spend.
Mm-hmm. The next question is also for you, Tim. I think it's someone's asking, are you seeing any movement in the initiative around the fact that you need to change the narrative around the fact that biofuels are actually environmentally or eco-friendly? Are you seeing any movement in that people are changing their minds on that?
So Europe has recognized implicitly that food and feed crop-based biofuels are a bad idea. And they basically put a cap on them when they created new aviation fuel requirements. They banned the use of food and feed crops for meeting them. They have not yet done that for energy crops. And as we talk about in the paper, energy crops use land too. They're not likely to actually produce much more per hectare. And in any event, it's worse than allowing land to just stay as forest or regrow, and hundreds of times worse than using that land for PV and uses of solar electricity. So I think it's happened somewhat in Europe. In the US, I think much less so. And in each place, there has not yet been a recognition that just basically using land has a cost, although sometimes you see it. In the IPCC, you'll often hear a lot of acknowledgement of the huge ecological costs of trying to have significant bioenergy, but frequently, and it's schizophrenic, frankly, frequently not treating that as a carbon cost by not factoring in all of the carbon implications of that land use. So again, it's all over the map at this point, I would say.
Rich, I'd like to pass this one to you. Someone commented that agriculture for food, the FAO basically says that we're producing enough food today to feed 10 billion people. So the problem's not land and production, it's all to do with the value chain. What have you got to say about that?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so I mean, as I mentioned, there's a lot that we can and should be doing on the consumption side of the equation. Diets that are high in meat, we can shift more towards plants. We should be looking to minimize food loss and waste wherever possible. I just wouldn't put all my eggs in the consumption basket to solve the problem. I mean, that statistic that says there's enough food to feed 10 billion people already basically assumes zero food waste, whereas right now there's about a third of the food that is produced is lost or wasted between the farm and the fork. It basically assumes mostly veganism everywhere, people eating the crops that are right now produced for animal feed and really only eating livestock products that are completely pasture based. And it also assumes no use of crops for biofuels. Right now, we know meat demand globally is growing. We know that governments are increasingly including bioenergy in their energy policies. So I think the thing is, yes, we need to work on the consumption side. And at the same time, we really need to do all of the above, as Tim said. We need to shift to more sustainable, healthy diets. We need to minimize food waste, and we need to accelerate productivity gains, both for crops and livestock, because we can't just assume some of these really unprecedented consumption changes are going to happen.
And I would say that the most obvious message is don't spend your land before you have it. So until and unless those massive changes happen, you don't have the land to spend on other things. And that's also one of the problems. Sometimes you can see a model that says, well, what if everyone goes vegan and then you have this land? But that's not reality. That's just a speculation for the future. And the other thing I'd say is something strange in the food business, right? If you said if everybody shared all of the world's housing or everyone shared all of the world's cars, would we have enough? And the answer is yes. But in order to do that, you have to take from the wealthy and give lots of that stuff to the poor. And how do we do that in the context of food? Well, we try to get the wealthy to eat less meat, to waste less food, but you can't just assume that everyone's going to do this. So it's a theoretical argument that has no real reality to it. We have to do what we can on the consumption side, but the slide that you really want to focus on is Rich's slide, which is that even if we'd had no production increases, no yield increases, we would clear 3 billion hectares of land. That's basically 4 times the continental United States. So production side increases are absolutely vital. They, in any kind of realistic projection of how you avoid land use change in the future, they play an even bigger role than consumption changes.
I guess one other thing I'd say there too is, so we projected the 600 million hectares of growth in agricultural land use under business as usual. We did also look at a bunch of scenarios that said, hey, if we cut food waste in half, shift diets that are high in meat towards plants, and also greatly accelerate crop and livestock productivity, yes, we could eliminate that land expansion and actually even free up several 100 million hectares of land that then could be used for restoration, or maybe sometime in the future using some of that for timber plantations, for example. But we also now have data from an entire decade towards 2050 that shows that even achieving, even holding it to 600 million hectares of land expansion isn't necessarily, that might still be optimistic. So again, we're in a world right now where we are greatly expanding agricultural land, and tropical deforestation is nowhere near zero.
Amanda asks whether the strategies for addressing this global land squeeze problem are different for developed versus developing countries. Anyone want to reflect on that?
Well, I think the answer is somewhat yes. So in developed countries where you already eat a lot of meat, for example, we want people to eat less meat per person and particularly less beef. We don't really think that's reasonable for the poor. So 6 billion people who are going to live in 2050 live in places now where the average consumption of meat and milk is 1/4 of that in the Western world. So it's not fair to say to those people, you can't increase somewhat more. And even in our projections, we assume the increase is only up to about half of Western levels. And even for much of the world, still not even close to that. So, from the demand side, there are somewhat different obligations, I think. And on the other side, in the developing countries, it's the real need is to increase yields and to use those yield increases to protect forests. Now, having said that, there is similarities. It's just beef, for example, is just extraordinarily land inefficient. Even from a food security standpoint, you want to emphasize anything other than beef, including milk or chicken or eggs, or let alone plant-based products, plant-based proteins. So I think those things would be similar in that approach.
Thanks very much, Tim. So I'm going to give the next 2 questions to you, Rich. One was just, what about agroforestry, where you're producing food and trees on the same land? Is that part of the solution here? And how do we reconcile reducing, both wanting livestock intensification suggested by this report with calls to reduce livestock pressures on important ecological grasslands?
Thanks, Janet, and both good questions. I would say on agroforestry, I mean, we think expanding agroforestry has a lot of promise. It depends maybe where in the world you are and what you're shifting from where to where. So, for example, in areas where yields are currently low, there's definitely potential to put more trees and shrubs on the land thereby boosting yields and also carbon stocks on the land, and also making the system more resilient to climate change. So there's a lot of great opportunities there. I think you can't say with agroforestry it's a one-size-fits-all approach. So I don't, if you're talking about a system with wall-to-wall corn in Iowa or something, if you're going to start putting trees on the land, then there might be decreases in yield, and then you have to think about the leakage effect elsewhere. So I think, yes, agroforestry has a lot of promise, but probably depends, again, where in the world you are and what kind of system you're shifting from what to what. In terms of livestock intensification question, it's actually a little bit similar to my last answer, which is in places where yields are currently low, we think there's a lot of potential and a lot of need. Tim mentioned some of those wetter pasture lands where maybe you could produce 2, 3, 4 times the amount of meat and milk on the same amount of land, and that's going to be needed. Remember the lines that I showed for growth in meat and milk demand out to 2050. At the same time, in places where folks are thinking about cutting back on livestock intensity, I think the thing to balance there is, well, if the decrease in meat consumption isn't as much or more as the decrease in meat production, then there is going to be some sort of leakage elsewhere. And so we have to be, again, really careful about policies that increase land demands per amount of food produced, especially since we have data over the past 10 years that shows meat consumption isn't coming down very quickly in high consuming countries.
Yeah, could I just add, there really is
we're
no
getting
way,
close to the top of the hour though, so let's just sort of
there's no way to
converge
get the
into it.
math to work unless you do both. You have to massively increase output per hectare in where you can in Latin America in particular, both for rising beef and milk, and frankly to free up some land for things like soybeans and other expansion. And you have to hold down consumption in richer countries. So even in richer countries, that doesn't really mean you can then produce less on your land. We need all of the above. That's part of the challenge. And so I'll just leave it there.
Just at the hour, Li Qing, haven't had any specific comments on charm. And by the way, that is a very charming name for the model, which is a carbon harvesting model. Any reflections from you on any of the questions we've had? Don't want to put you on the spot, so it's okay to say no.
Oh, no, thanks. I think Tim and Rich take over all the questions very well. Thanks.
Okay.
And I also actually, Janet, real quick on charm, I also want to acknowledge Jessica Zients, who's the fourth, who's also an author of this report, worked with WRI, is now gone off, she's doing a doctoral program. I think she's with us as a participant today. And she also named the charm model. So not only did she help design it, but she also gave it the charming name. So thanks, also shout out to Jess.
It's really good marketing for something biophysical model to give it such a great name. So Jessica, we're missing you. We wish you were here to join us. I said we only got 3 of the 4 great authors here. We're pretty much at the hour. There was a quick question, if you could just answer it really briefly, Rich, about regenerative farming, particularly for cattle raising. Is that a commercially viable solution in the context of the challenges that you've spoke about today?
Yeah, I mean, at risk of repeating myself, I mean, well, first of all, regenerative is a word that means a lot of things to a lot of different people. So I think we have to be very clear about what is the exact system that we're talking about. And again, if we're talking about a system, shifting to a system in a place where yields are low, then and shifting to it isn't going to increase land demands per amount of meat produced, then, absolutely. If we're shifting from a system that produces more meat and milk to a system that produces less, again, we're going to have to account for the leakage effects unless we're able to reduce meat consumption by that same amount. And so, for example, there was a paper that showed that in the US, if we shifted to a fully grass-fed system, and all beef was grass-finished, we would only have enough land to produce 27% of the beef that we currently produce, which basically means you have to consume 70% less beef than we do today. So again, we have to think about these trade-offs as we think about producing more food, more wood for a growing population, and also hitting our nature and our climate goals.
Excellent, thanks. So let me thank everyone who took the time to join us today. As I said, we'll put the recording up in the next few days. You'll find it on the event page. And I think as Mark Twain again said that, land is finite, we'll not make it anymore. He said, buy it. I think these people would say, use it wisely, because it has a huge opportunity cost, both for food security, for climate change, and for biodiversity. So thanks very much. Great lineup. Please check out all of our other materials on the WRI website. And until we see you again, have a good rest of the day.